basically the person's body and soul, as it were, are under are basically owned by you. I said, if that's the kind of picture that you have of the Old Testament, you're totally misreading it. Secondly, the term slave or slavery itself is a problematic translation. Obviously, for one, it brings up all of those things that we associate with the antebellum South, and when you look more closely, you see that it's a far cry from what is going on in the antebellum South.
Should you read the Old Testament to your kids?
Yes.
And if you do, okay, then if we're going to read the Old Testament to our kids, then what about the passages about slavery, Brett? And what about all the misogyny in the Old Testament? And what about all the mean things that God does?
Yeah, you just have to tell your kids that, hey, the God of the Old Testament is a meanie, but the God of the New Testament is loving. And so...
Oh, I was going to say just skip those parts.
Oh, okay. Well, you can take that strategy as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, because there has been there's a popular pastor a couple years ago that said, you know what, we really don't need the Old Testament. We should just focus on the New Testament. And I know as a parent, sometimes it is hard to read the Old Testament because you inevitably get those questions like, Mom, why did God do that? Or, wait, is God for slavery and these things? So today, listeners, we have a special guest to help us answer these questions about should we read the Old Testament to our kids, and how can we understand it, and how can we help them understand it? So we have the great fortune of having with us we are at a conference with Dr. Copan, but we have Dr. Paul Copan as our guest. His wife Jackie is here with us too, who we love. They are friends of ours, but Dr. Copan is a professor of philosophy at Palm Beach Atlantic University. He's written and edited over 40 books, so I will not even try to list all of those, but the two books that Brett and I have sitting in front of us of Dr. Copan's is God a Moral Monster? Making Sense of the Old Testament God, and Is God a Vindictive Bully? And then let me read the subtitle, Reconciling Portrayals of God in the Old and New Testament. So that's what we have brought Dr. Copan today to talk to us about, because on the Maven Parent Podcast, over and over again, we talk about doing the simple thing of reading the Bible to your kids, that you don't have to get some fancy curriculum. You don't have to spend money to disciple our kids, to teach our kids about God. We want to actually just read them the scripture. There's power in that. And the Holy Spirit uses that. And so, but there's this hard thing of this culture that was thousands and thousands of years ago. We're in 21st century America. So how do we make sense of all that? So, Paul, thank you so much for being on the podcast with us today.
I appreciate it. What a privilege to be with you too, dear friends and partners in ministry. So thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, okay. So before we jump into the books, which I'm anxious to do, because I think a lot of people who are familiar with your work, Paul, see the great service I think you've done for the church in this. But we want to get personal here a little bit. And okay, so tell us some of your background. Growing up, did you grow up in a Christian home? Mom and dad, family life, all of that good stuff.
Well, I grew up in a pastor's home. My parents had funny accents. My dad came from Ukraine, my mom from Latvia. They met in Germany after the war and went through all sorts of horrific things. My mom survived the bombing of Berlin, and my dad went through the Ukrainian Holodomor, which was the forced famine in Ukraine, and his father ended up dying of starvation in that. And then World War II came, and my dad was very much in despair and called out to God, and his heart was filled with peace, and he thereafter received a German New Testament that someone had given to him, and he ended up saying, this is what I want to commit my life to. So he ended up going into the pastorate, studied at seminary when he came to the States. And so I grew up in a pastor's home, and my dad pastored a Russian, Ukrainian Baptist church for 18 years in Cleveland, and was involved in Slavic radio and literature and so forth. So had a very good example, loving parents. They really encouraged us to study the scriptures, even the Old Testament parts that could be so difficult. And grew up in a loving family. Had there's 7 kids in our family as well, and so we first experienced the love of God through our parents, and it became real to me in high school. Actually, I was exposed to Christian apologetics in high school, and I started to see that this faith that my parents had passed on to me wasn't just something that could fit in well with, kind of you just grow up and it gives you a structure, but this is actually true. This is Jesus rose from the dead. There are good historical reasons for that. And so that really attracted me to the Christian faith. It was something that I could own for myself. And so it was in that context that I started to see the value of Christian apologetics. Went on to go to seminary. I did an undergrad in biblical studies. I went to Trinity Seminary to get a master's of divinity degree. And my first semester there, I took an elective in religious epistemology, a philosophy course, and really liked it. It found that it just answered so many questions for me. Stuart Hackett, a noted professor from yesteryear, had actually been a mentor and inspiration for William Lane Craig. He was teaching the class, and I thought, this is really helpful. And I ended up adding a degree in philosophy to my Master of Divinity degree, and then got to meet my wife in the Chicago area when I was at Trinity Seminary, and we ended up getting married after I graduated, and we were on staff with the church. I was on staff with a church in upstate New York for 6.5 years, and then went on to get a PhD in philosophy. I had 4 kids at the time, and then our 5th one was born in Wisconsin, and but have been involved in apologetics and Christian philosophy ever since that time. So now I'm teaching at Palm Beach Atlantic University. We have a nice, just wonderful MA philosophy of religion program there, and an undergrad in apologetics, and certificate program in apologetics, and so forth. So a lot of good things are happening, and so really glad to be where the Lord has placed me, and so glad also to be talking about these important issues that you're, on the Old Testament. So whenever we get to that, that's fine. But that's a little bit of the background.
Now, in your kind of your testimony, was there any kind of deviation or rebellion, or it sounds like it was a pretty solid upbringing, Christian family. Mm-hmm. You kind of stayed the course. Or were there any serious times where maybe you walked away, or was it a pretty
doubt?
Yeah,
mm-hmm.
Yeah. I suppose anyone who goes through life will have questions, and so you will have doubts, or you wonder, how do I make sense of this? And so I think just kind of questions that we all have, and so of course questions always continue, but there's never really a thought to deviate from what seemed very solid and well grounded. And when you looked at the alternatives, there wasn't anything that made better sense than what I came to see in the Christian faith. So the intellectual resources, the existential resources, that God, the Christian faith speaks not only to the issues related to our minds, but also to the needs of our heart as well. And so I just saw that this was just a wonderful dynamic, and just saw that played out over and over again. Of course, hearing stories about people who had been atheists becoming believers. Of course, you'll read deconversion stories too, and so forth. But again, when you look at the reasons for why do people leave the Christian faith, I just don't find them persuasive to kind of overturn the strength of what I've seen in the Christian faith, that there's such a solid framework to make sense of, human dignity, morality, the design of the universe, the beginning of the universe, and so forth, that you have a kind of a structure in place. Yes, there may be, what seems to be a hole in the wall here, or, something that doesn't quite fit, but the structure remains intact. And I've always had that sort of an understanding that things fit well together, things work, intellectually, existentially. And so there wasn't any point of rebellion in my own life where I went off course somehow. It's been a fairly steady, thank the Lord for that course.
Yeah, and I bring that up because that's my story too. Is growing up with Christian parents. My parents they put their faith in Christ when I was like 10 months old, and so they got right involved in the church. Were on fire for the Lord, and so I was raised in the church. Had this really healthy upbringing in the church. Was part of very good churches, had a youth ministry and a youth pastor who were big mentors, mentored me right into ministry. And there was no like serious time of rebellion. And I think it's just, it is good to hear those stories. It's good to hear both sides, where those who have kind of, come out of, kind of you got this, whatever, the sex, drugs, and rock and roll testimonies all the way to this steady faithfulness in the church. And I've looked back on that, and kind of two reflections is, number one, there's this confidence that Christianity can deliver, so to speak. It can deliver a rich, significant, flourishing, meaningful life. And that, and for parents who are listening, I want them to consider that, like a good Christian home can really point your kids to Christ, and that it's actually satisfying. It's more satisfying, it's much more rich and robust and than the secular alternatives out there that are being put before our kids all the time. And then we can have some confidence that as we think this out well and we live it out well, right? It's a Christian world and life view that it's superior, and so there is the possibility of providing a home, a solid home life that really helps our kids to catch this. And you had that, and I had that, and others have had other testimonies. But it's like, and this is why it's so important, I think, for us to share testimonies, is to hear the testimonies, because I look back on my testimony, and it's not it's not quote unquote exciting in what we hear often, someone who gives up and shares their testimony, but I look back on that just with a lot of thankfulness. And
well, I like the way you said that, Paul, about it made them, basically made the most sense. The Christian worldview, as you saw, it helped the reality you saw of life. It matched with that. And that's what we talk about on the podcast, is talking to our kids about the faith, not in this like blind faith, you just kind of hope it's real kind of thing. But no, the Christian worldview makes sense of reality. It's the story of reality. That's God's story. And so I love how you said that, because it just, as you went through life, you just kept seeing things and, oh yeah, this matches up well. This answers this the best way. So that's a good word and a good encouragement to parents, because that your guys' stories are the stories we actually want for all of our kids. That we would like that, to have them have this anchor, that as the storms and winds and changes of life, that they are anchored in this way. Which is why when we thought about and talk about teaching the kids the Bible, I have gotten many times the questions about, okay, but what parts do we skip over? Because Erin, come on. Some of this stuff, the Old Testament is pretty gnarly,
That's what we say in Southern California.
Oh yeah, sorry.
It's pretty gnarly.
I understand. I didn't need a translator for that.
Yeah, he lives in Florida. Come on. But, and so, and knowing you, I just love that you wrote these books, because you're just such a kind-hearted guy, and I know how you are as a husband and a father, and you're the real deal. And you take on these topics, and you're not afraid to talk about it, because God isn't a moral monster, as claims are thrown against God, and he's not a vindictive bully. And no, we shouldn't avoid the Old Testament. Why? Because the Old Testament is, of course, the story of Israel, but it's who God is. It's what he does through these people who continue to turn from him. And he, of course, has times where he executes justice, but there's so many times he executes mercy and extends mercy.
Yeah.
And so let's dive into this. And I guess maybe, I don't know if we want to take it like...
Well, I have an opening question.
Okay, go ahead with that, and then we'll get into some of the issues.
Okay,
Okay, go ahead.
So I kind of, the bigger picture, and I think I was kind of referencing this jokingly in the intro, but there is this sense that a lot of Christians have of, okay, God of the Old Testament, different than the God of the New Testament. So let's start there. Let's say, a mom and dad, their kid brings that up. How do you answer that, Paul?
Yeah. I say that the God of the Old Testament is identical to the God of the New Testament, and Jesus himself reveals both the kindness and the severity of God. So Paul says in Romans 11:22, and this is like a theme verse in my book, Is God a Vindictive Bully?, where I'm pushing back against two angles, where I'm looking at one, say the new atheists who say God is mean, nasty, severe, and they totally ignore the kindness of God. They ignore the manifestations of God's patience, God's love, God's giving himself over and over again to rebellious people and so on. Then you have the others who are, say, within the church, people like Greg Boyd and various scholars, Peter Enns and so on, where they emphasize the kindness of God. God is loving. Turn the other cheek. Love your enemies and so forth. But they ignore those other severe texts that also reveal to us God's attitude towards sin, what God's wrath should look like. And so sometimes there's a lot of cherry picking going on, certain verses ignored and so forth. And what I'm trying to do is hold things in proper tension. It's not as though I've resolved everything, but I'm trying to hold things in proper tension between that, in that kindness and severity, where people want to go to one extreme or the other. And so I will say, for example, Jesus. We see the kindness of Jesus. Come to me, you who are weary and heavy laden, I will give you rest. Jesus is described as one who will not snuff out a smoldering wick or break a bruised reed. And we see the kindness, the tenderness of Jesus. But then we see Jesus as being depicted as one who will rule the nations with a rod of iron, one who drives out money changers from the temple, one who says if someone leads one of these little ones astray, it'd be better had a millstone hung around his neck and for him to be drowned in the depths of the sea. Very severe stuff here. We see Jesus portrayed in the New Testament in severe ways that a lot of people just kind of ignore. Yes, we see the kindness, the love of God manifested in the cross of Christ. But what about texts like where Jesus says he's going to strike dead the followers of this false prophetess Jezebel, where he says, we read in Jude 5, the best manuscripts say, Jesus, after he had delivered the Israelites from Egypt, destroyed those who did not believe. That's Jesus. So you'll see some things, even in red letters, that Jesus is saying in the New Testament that seem very severe. And we read about the wrath of the Lamb in Revelation chapter 6. There's the self-sacrificial Lamb on the one hand, but there's also the wrath of the Lamb for those who engage in acts that oppose God, that are destructive and harmful to others. And I remind people of people like N.T. Wright, who says that sometimes we just have, some people are so wicked that you just have to pray judgment upon them. That there are, that when we look at the wrath of God also, we need to understand that if God is not wrathful, then God is not loving. So often we will kind of pit things against each other, but what I'm trying to do is bring some of these things together and put them in their proper perspective. And so the God of the Old Testament is being revealed by Jesus in the New Testament. And we can say, yes, some certain things are kind of pushed past. Certain things about the Old Testament are no longer relevant for us as the people of God. We're not a nation of God's people any longer, but we're scattered throughout every tribe and tongue and people and nation. And so the scenario looks a bit different, but we shouldn't detach ourselves or unhitch ourselves, as Andy Stanley has said. We shouldn't unhitch ourselves from the Old Testament, because that's Jesus' Bible. That's where Jesus is learning, studying, growing up, and learning and becoming wise and so forth. As a young man, and seeing his own identity in those Old Testament scriptures. So to neglect those things is actually to neglect a major portion of our Christian heritage, that Israel's story is our story. And we need to come to understand that, and yes, work through some of those kinks, some of those difficulties, but to understand that we should not reject the Old Testament, but actually see what are some of these resources in the Old Testament that actually strengthen our faith, that actually put things in perspective, that actually make sense of what Jesus' ministry looks like, and the kind of words that he is saying, and speaking like a prophet from the Old Testament, but speaking to his own nation of Israel, speaking about judgment that is to come in AD 70 with the Romans. There's that language that still continues over. So we ought to be very careful about just trashing, dismissing, leaving behind the Old Testament and saying, I'm going to stick with Jesus, because there's a lot of kind of Old Testament stuff, as it were, in the ministry and teaching of Jesus.
Yeah, and I think when it's characterized this way, or someone characterizes Jesus as this almost this kind of sappy version of Jesus. He's all love. It's like, well, wait a second. Have you read Jesus completely? I mean, the more you're in the Gospels and you're listening to what he says, there's not just this meek, mild, gentle picture of Jesus. You're not getting the whole picture. So it might be that first step is you just got to read more. Kind of what you're saying.
Yeah.
But you know what, Paul, give us some examples, because I'm just thinking about a parent out there who's saying, okay, well, all right, same God, Old and New Testament, but can you give us some examples of God's loving kindness that is revealed in the Old Testament?
Yeah. We see God repeatedly renewing his covenant with his people. After the golden calf incident in Exodus 32, you can go back further if you want, that God, even though there is this flood in Genesis 6 through 8, we see the story of Noah, and then in chapter 9, God renews the covenant, brings about an eternal covenant with humanity, and so even though God is grieved with human disobedience, God doesn't say, okay, that's it, forget it. God begins anew. God, it's like a picture of a new creation. So there's this picture of new creation, renewed covenant. We see God doing this with his people Israel throughout Israel's wilderness wanderings and so forth. God is sending prophets to warn the people of Israel, saying, judgment is to come. Don't abandon the covenant that God has made with you. Don't leave him. And God even speaks, like in Ezekiel 6:9, God says, how I have been hurt by their adulterous hearts. God is speaking about his own woundedness. So God speaks in loving terms. God sees himself in terms of in a husband-wife relationship. We read the book of Hosea, where there is this brokenness, as it were, this tenderness that God reveals toward his people. Yes, they're judgment worthy, but that's not the end of the story. There's also mercy. There's also compassion. That God's anger, yes, it's fierce, but joy, restoration comes in the morning. So you see, yes, there is anger, but remember that God is described in Exodus 34 as being slow to anger. That God is, yes, anger. If you don't get angry, there's something wrong. There's a lot of evil in the world. If you don't get angry, that's a problem. But we see God is portrayed as being slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness. So we'll see them not pitted against each other, but we'll see them side by side, where there is loving kindness, there is compassion, but God is not going to leave the guilty unpunished either. And we want a God who will stand up for justice. We want to make sure, we don't want, say, a Mother Teresa and an Adolf Hitler to simply end up in the same place where Hitler ends up getting away with murder millions of times over. No, we want cosmic justice to be done. There's something wrong with a picture where these issues are not being addressed, where injustices continue and never go unspoken for. So what we need to see is that this God is concerned about restoring his people, that God is one who seeks to renew that covenant, that God would prefer to show mercy over judgment. And that's something we see over and over again. That God is saying, finally, he says, okay, that's it. I'm going to bring judgment. He does that with the Canaanites too. He waits over half a millennium. In Genesis 15:6 tells us that he's going to wait until the sins of the Amorites is filled up. Well, he's going to wait for half a millennium. It's going to include Israel being enslaved in Egypt and so forth. But God is waiting that long until the time is ripe for judgment. So when Genesis 15:16 is talking about that, there is there's even in that verse, there is a lot of patience. There's a lot of waiting, a lot of tolerating of human wrongdoing until finally the time is right to bring judgment. And it would have been wrong for the Israelites to go in earlier, before that time was ripe. Mm-hmm. So those are a few examples of God's endurance, even willing to restore over and over again, bring people back from exile, et cetera. So
yeah, go ahead. Well, I'll just a thought here. But as you're talking, I think part of the problem sometimes for us in the church, and even as we talk to our kids about God, we don't lay out a full picture of God's nature and his attributes. And so often I'm not sure I want to say overemphasize the love of God, but we do so at the expense of other attributes, because we want to say, in one sense, hey, God's love is it's just unspeakable, right? It's unconditional.
Well, we say the word, but we say the word love, but we don't help kids understand it.
Right. So there's that aspect means. Too. Yeah, so it's even actually defining it.
It's like a warm, fuzzy feeling.
But there's this additional part where that's all we talk about. Mm-hmm. And so we may inadvertently distort our kids' view of God without giving them this fuller picture of God being a just God, God being a holy God, God being a wrathful God, and these other pieces that start to help us make sense of the entire biblical message. And in addition to that, I think what you said earlier, I just wanted to highlight, because I just talked about this at church on Sunday when I preached, but the idea that when you understand God's justice and you understand judgment and punishment and all of that, and God's holiness, that actually helps you to understand his love in much deeper and richer ways as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so getting that full picture is so important.
Yeah. And it just brought something to mind too about how kind of a common worldview, one sociologist, Christian Smith, says is, we live in a worldview that's, saturated with this moralistic therapeutic deism. And I think perhaps because we've ignored some of those aspects of the wrath of God, the holiness of God, the judgment of God, the accountability that we have before God for actions that, people, when they come across a God who is wrathful, or they come across, say, the problem of evil, when, they'll say, oh, I can't believe in a God like that. That can't be, God has to make me happy. God has to make me feel good. And if there's something, if I encounter something about God that doesn't square with that perception, then, just get rid of God, because that, I can't believe in a God like that. And so, we need a much more robust teaching about who God is, and to give our children, the next generation, a balanced picture of who this God is. So,
I'm thinking too, we need more robust teaching on sin.
Yes, indeed.
Because I've heard it said, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this, Paul, but that the problem with how we sometimes look at the Old Testament and kind of place judgment on God is that we don't take sin seriously enough.
Yeah.
And we have this light view of what sin is. And so do you think that's part of our problem too?
Yeah. Oh yeah, I certainly do. And one of the things that often gets ignored, say when people raise the question of, what about the Canaanites? Well, remember the Canaanites, God is waiting until their sin is finally filled up. So there is wickedness here. There is judgment that comes upon them for doing things that would be considered criminal, evil in any civilized society, infant sacrifice, bestiality, incest, ritual prostitution. These are not light things. These are things that are wickedness, that are judgment worthy. And so often we present the Canaanites as though they, just kind of minding their own business, really would be really nice neighbors and so forth. And yet, God sends the Israelites in to drive them out and so forth. Well, there's another picture here, and I do have a take on warfare and hyperbole and so forth. But it's important to know that there was judgment in the picture here that needed to be addressed. And in fact, as you look at Israel's own unfolding story, there's kind of a spiritual warfare going on, that the salvation of the world is in the balance here, and Israel needs to, cannot be pulled off course to such a degree that its identity and mission are compromised, again, in the coming of Jesus of Nazareth. So there's a lot at stake here. And but that's another bit of the picture here in terms of the severity of sin, but that's just an example. But we do see that in, for example, in Leviticus 10, where Aaron's sons are guilty of offering strange fire before the Lord, probably an act of idolatry. But they are struck down, kind of like Ananias and Sapphira in the New Testament. Similar looking story there. But God tells Aaron, whose sons have just been struck down, saying that, I will be treated as holy by those who draw near to me. So he's going to be treated in an honorable way. And really, the closer you get to God, the more prepared you have to be in the Old Testament. You've got to go through a lot of hoops to prepare to meet this holy God, and the high priest can only go into the Holy of Holies once a year. So so everything is seen as a huge buildup until that momentous point, and even there's a rope tied around that high priest who goes in, because if he's not taking God seriously, then he's going to be pulled out as a dead man by that rope. And so God is one who, yes, he is loving, he is compassionate, but he's also one who takes sin seriously. And so that's so that's. Yeah.
And personal, because you mentioned before the book of Hosea, and how oftentimes when God is talking to the nation of Israel, he uses the metaphor of adultery, of being cheated on, and that should awaken in us that it's personal to God, and in a way that any of us would feel a betrayal like that would be so deep, and do we think about our sin? Do we think about the world's sin in that kind of way? I don't think we do.
Yeah. And you'll often see in connection with that, the jealousy of God. And I talk about that in the Moral Monster book, that, there can be a petty jealousy. And of course, that's the kind of thing that Oprah Winfrey said, I don't like a God who's jealous. Well, you know what? If you've got a marriage and there's someone who is a third party intruding in on that marriage, jealousy is appropriate. It is right. And, that marriage is to be exclusive. And so when you see that mention of idolatry, these God substitutes that come up, God's jealousy is aroused. Why? Because he's made a loving covenant. He's taken these people out of the land of Egypt. He's delivered them. He's reminding them, I brought you out of the land of Egypt. Don't have any other gods before me. And, and when they do that, it's a violation, that deeply personal violation of the God who has lovingly cared for them, who has brought them this redemption, and yet they are mistreating God. They're treating as common this covenant that God has made with them, and treating it with disregard. So yes, there is that deeply personal dimension, and God is seen as someone who is, in a sense, vulnerable, and even exasperated. God says in Isaiah 5, what more was I to do for my vineyard than had been done in it? That God is saying, open your mouth wide, Psalm 81:10, open your mouth wide and I will fill it. But my people refused to listen to my voice, and so I gave them over to the desires of their hearts. So God is doing his best to try to work with his people, providing them all sorts of opportunities, but over and over again, they're continuing to turn away from that, follow after idols, arousing God's jealousy, and then finally says, okay, there's no remedy. They've got judgment has to fall.
One interesting thing that you talk about is the context that we're reading these Old Testament narratives, But there's a context there, a historical context, and you talk about this, the ancient Near East, and how that, because we come to the text, right, with our modern sensibilities, and then we read some of this stuff and we think, oh my gosh, it just strikes us as wrong or evil or whatever. But just give us maybe a snippet on okay, we want to help our kids understand the historical context, the background, the ancient Near East, where these texts are written in.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one very good example here is kosher foods. We think, well, that's really strange. What's going on here? And we think that there's something very, very odd about that. Or why should you wear, say, clothing that doesn't, that has only one fiber? Why can't you mix fibers? Or why can't you plant different
Levitical laws?
Two different crops in one field? What's up with that? Well, these are really at that level. I can say that God is reminding the people of Israel that they are not to be mixed in. Like crops or clothing, you've got mixed fabrics, but they're not to be mixed in along with the nations where their identity and mission are compromised. So God is giving laws to remind them, whether it's related to sexuality, whether it's related to eating your food or planting your crops. In every facet of life, you are to be reminded that you are the people of God, that you're not to be mixed in with the nations and lose your distinctiveness. So that's kind of an example of those foods. And we talk about certain laws in say Leviticus, where you have mention of semen and blood and so forth. And we think, well, these taboos that are related to these things, what's that all about? Well, in our world, we think, oh, that's odd. But in that world, the semen and blood were pictures of kind of a departure of life from an organism, and so these were again reminders to the people that you do certain things in light of the, kind of privileging life over death. And so there are certain, cleansings and so forth that went along with that. And that was just part of the world that was understood. Think of sacrifices. We think of, I know, my wife and I know someone very well who says, I can't believe in a God who would, allow his son to die this barbaric death on the cross. That just seems so, degrading. And so it also seems so primitive and barbaric. And my response to that is, well, one, when sacrifices were being offered in the ancient Near East, it wasn't as though this is unusual. This was something that was part of what people understood. That was the vocabulary. And so God enters into this world of sacrifices and offering animals and so forth, and turns this into an institution that will ultimately lead to the sacrifice of Jesus, which will end all those sacrifices. And so perhaps one of the reasons we think that's barbaric is because we're no longer offering sacrifices precisely because of what Jesus did. He did this once and for all. And it's not as though sacrifices aren't practiced in other parts of the world today either. So a lot of people can definitely relate to or resonate with that notion of sacrifice. And so when we come to look at some of these things, we, rather than being, as C.S. Lewis said, chronological snobs and saying, oh, that's so primitive, or I can't believe they did that back then. Well, a little charitability goes a long way here in saying, well, let me just try to understand this culture in its time. Let me try to understand what some of the values were back then, rather than trying to superimpose my own values upon them from today. So when you think about warfare, we think, oh yeah, war is, it's not as though war is something that's to be glorified, or we say, this is great. No, I mean, war was just a way of life in the ancient Near East, whereas today, we think, we've lived in a lot of war avoiding, war deterring situations where this just has not been part of our everyday lives, whereas in the ancient Near East it was. And so Israel has to live within this sort of a setting. What is Israel to do? Well, there are certain parameters that God gives for them. When it comes to things like, we think we have a welfare system. We have people who are receiving aid from the government and so forth. Well, in the ancient Near East, you just didn't have that. And so you will have certain compensations for that to help people out of economic tight spots and so forth. But it's not as though we say, well, why couldn't they have done those things that we're doing today back then? Well, these things take time. Cultures develop. God is meeting the people where they are and trying to give, and he's giving commands to help people deal with their situations in their own context, moving them in a redemptive direction, even though it's not this, say, perfect utopian picture here, but it's actually moving them in the right direction. And so that's the sort of thing that I'm trying to communicate to people, that even some of the laws in the Old Testament, like God permits divorce. Jesus says that in Matthew 19:8 that Moses permitted divorce. Why? Because of the hardness of human hearts. It wasn't because this was ideal. And so God is working in a very non-ideal situation. He's getting his hands dirty and working with the people in their own fallen ancient Near Eastern context. And so we ought to give some latitude for that things looked a lot different back then than they do now. And so let's not measure it according to what we are doing now, but rather allowing it to be as it was and seeing what redemptive ideas that God has in mind as he's trying to move his people forward.
Yeah, we see that context. When you put it into context, you can actually appreciate the radical moral improvement that God is suggesting in this ancient Near East context.
Yeah, and I think as a woman, sometimes reading the Old Testament, I've wondered about some of the things that you hear and different. What in 21st century America seems like, well, that's kind of mean to not let women do this or to not let women do that, or why was this? But when you understand and do a little work, like you're saying, of understanding context and extending charity to the time and place. And I love how Lewis does talk about this chronological snobbery, because we have that. We all struggle with that.
Yeah.
And do we ever reflect on, I wonder what 100 years from now people will say was a blind spot for us.
Right.
Do we ever think about that?
Yeah. It reminds me of a poem by Alexander Pope, who said, "We think our fathers fools, so wise we grow. Our wiser sons, no doubt, will think us so."
Yes.
So there is that sort of a thing that really every generation will have that sort of a tension. I would do things better, and then later on they say, well, we're going to do better than those people did, and so that is a generational thing. But yeah, you're right. That chronological snobbery can be a real pitfall, and so that charitability goes a long way. And even when it comes to the issue of women, how are women treated? Well, it's helpful to understand, for one thing, that there are some things that are merely descriptive rather than prescriptive. So there are some things that are simply being described. It's not as though these things are commended. You think of, say, the nameless concubine at the end of the book of Judges, and she is brutally treated. Well, it's not as though the Bible is endorsing this. In fact, that's called a terrible, despicable act and so forth. I mean, there's a war that comes as a result of this, because those people refuse to acknowledge that they've done wrong, and they refuse to give up the people who did this terrible act. And so there is something that is descriptive, but it doesn't mean that God is endorsing everything that is being described in the Old Testament. So we also need to make sure that we are understanding that, and even when it comes to, say, the women in the Old Testament, we see that women are, for example, children are to honor their father and their mother, not honor their father and a piece of furniture. They're to, we see that someone like Deborah rises up, and she is a judge in Israel. We see that the Proverbs 31 woman is someone who is very entrepreneurial. She's doing stuff that's really kind of running on kind of a parallel track to her husband, who's in the city gates. She's doing real estate investment. She's doing commerce and so forth. I mean, really someone who is doing all sorts of things, rather than just simply staying in the home. And of course, that's wonderful and appropriate, and that's real work. But you see someone who's also involved in all sorts of work outside of the home as well that can be blessed and affirmed by God as well. So again, reading more widely, reading more carefully, seeing that there's some things that you perhaps have ignored as you look at how women are treated in the Old Testament. Well, there's a bigger picture here, and so I try to unpack some of those things in those books.
As a dad, how did you and Jackie approach these kinds of topics with your kids? Like, just on a real practical, normal level, like, were these conversations that came up? Would you help your kids to give them context? Maybe before you read a book with them of the Bible, you would talk about the culture. How did it work out kind of in your home?
Yeah. Well, we were often reading the scriptures. We would read stories from scripture, read portions of scripture, and so forth. So every evening we'd have our family dinner, and then we would open up the floor for whatever questions they might have. So sometimes it might be questions that they had about the Bible, questions that they had about things that came up at school, and so forth. So our kids went, and we're in public school, and again we probably would think otherwise today, given all that's going on in public schools. But on the other hand, we would encourage our kids to ask questions. So we really wanted to create this kind of a culture of questioning, of being curious, of wanting to know what's going on here, not wanting to silence the questions. And so I remember our oldest daughter asking, how could God send a flood that brought judgment upon these people? And I said, well, keep in mind that these people were very wicked. That it wasn't as though this was just God did this arbitrarily, but this is human beings had spoiled things so much, they had brought so much damage, so much violence already. God was simply finishing off what they had begun. And so anyway, those sorts of questions come up, or Dad, would you really offer me up like God offered up Abraham's son Isaac? And so you answer those questions. You say, well, a few things here. Abraham knew that Isaac was going to come back with him. He just didn't know how. Isaac was that child of promise. Isaac was a miracle child, and that God was going to bring blessing to all the nations through Isaac and his offspring. And so when Abraham says, we will go and worship, and we will return, he's confident, however God is going to work that out, that Isaac is going to accompany him, that promise will not fail, that God is going to do what he has said. And so it's a different circumstance than ordinary parents today, where we don't have that promise. We don't have a miracle child. We're not part of that biblical, historical story where God is working out his purposes to lead us to the Messiah, the Savior of the world, and so forth. So I try to, again, would try to handle them in this way. And of course, kind of like when you're teaching your kids about sex education, you begin small. You begin with kind of the basics. It's not as you have to go into all sorts of details either. Yeah. But it's also good to keep in mind that there are some that we want a God who will defend those who are marginalized. We want a God who will protect the innocent and punish the guilty. And as you look at the Old Testament, one of the things that stands out is that God, unlike other ancient Near Eastern law collections, is that God is very concerned about those who could most easily be taken advantage of, the poor, the orphan, the widow, the alien in their midst. And God is reminding the people, you were once aliens in the land of Egypt. He's reminding them 36 times of their own history in the land of Egypt. So he's saying, let this story that you have lived out be part of, let that inform how you treat those who can easily be taken advantage of in your own society, to look out for them, to provide ways in which they can enter into the mainstream of society where they can be supported and so forth. So that is really, I think, a remarkable kind of part of the heartbeat of the Old Testament law that a lot of people often ignore. They'll look at, here's a gotcha text, here's another gotcha text. But if you ignore these broader contexts of loving the alien as and letting the alien be as one who is as the native under the law of Moses, this is really remarkable compared to other ancient Near Eastern law collections. So I'm trying to call people's attention to some of these things that often get bypassed. But these are, like I said, part of the heartbeat of the Old Testament law that needs to be reinforced, that we see the kindness of God at work here.
Well, I hope our listeners are getting a glimpse into the fact that we are able to offer really good explanations for what people see in the Old Testament, the things they highlight that just doesn't sit right. But we have good explanations. Paul, you've done so much work on this in these two books. So I think just encourage parents, maybe two of the books to start with that Paul's written, Is God a Moral Monster? And then Is God a Vindictive Bully?
Have these as resources in your home. So then, I love the nurturing of questions in your kids and not shutting those down. And then when our kids ask questions, we can pull these kinds of books out and say, oh, you know what? There are Christians that have thought about this stuff actually for thousands of years. And I have a book that can help us answer this question.
Yeah, just even if they're in this, for some folks who don't have some background in apologetics or maybe a little intimidated by it, and you even look at a book like this and you look it through, and I mean, Paul really does do some comprehensive work here, but you might look at it and go, gosh, it's a lot of stuff, and you don't even have to read through all of it in one sitting. You can kind of have it as a reference, because as these questions come up, you can go, oh, okay, yeah, look, Paul here he addresses it here. Let's read this chapter together. Or, but I want to hit on one topic before we let you go here, Paul, because it's so prominent, and especially with conversations about race in our culture, it gets brought up. It's the issue of slavery,
Right.
Yeah, and I hear young people ask this one all the time. Okay. And it gets put something like this: doesn't the Bible endorse slavery? Yeah. Right. So how would you answer that one?
A few things to unpack here. One is, what do you mean by slavery? Do you mean the antebellum South? Do you mean people who are treated as property? Do you mean that if, say, a slave runs away, that he ought to be brought back to his harsh master and brutally punished? That there ought to be, that you have to have a law of return that was in the antebellum South. That you can, basically the person's body and soul, as it were, are under are basically owned by you. I said, if that's the kind of picture that you have of the Old Testament, you're totally misreading it. Secondly, the term slave or slavery itself is a problematic translation. Obviously, for one, it brings up all of those things that we associate with the antebellum South. And when you look more closely, you see that it's a far cry from what is going on in the antebellum South. So, for example, you have for Israelite servants, if you gouge out, this is indentured servitude, by the way, so you have a term limit to how long you serve, and you're basically paying off a debt. So servitude comes because you're impoverished and you have, you don't have alternatives. So you basically kind of parcel yourself and your family out to basically work for someone else for a certain set of time, and you can't go past that 6-year limit. But so there are term limits. Secondly, there are also gleaning laws that are to encourage people not to get into servitude, to help them prevent them from going to poverty. So picking, what hasn't been cut from a field or picked from a tree in someone's yard, this is to be a provision for the Israelites so they don't have to go into servitude. You have, for example, the refuge that runaway slaves from foreign countries have, that the Israelites were told to let them settle in any of Israel's cities rather than sending them back to their harsh taskmasters, because they themselves, were slaves in the land of Egypt. But we're also told, we read that there are various extradition treaties in the ancient Near East between the Hittites and others, where if there is a runaway slave, you have to send him back to the master, and if you don't, that is a capitally punishable offense. But the Israelites are saying, no, let those harshly treated people come here. Let them settle in Israel. Let it be a place of refuge for them. We also see kidnapping, for example. That was forbidden in Israel. It was forbidden generally in the ancient Near East. And so the very thing that got slavery going in the modern world, kidnapping, basically was prohibited in the ancient Near Eastern world. You also have, the question is, well, what about bringing harm to someone? Well, if you gouge out an eye or knock out a tooth, then that servant who is indebted, gets to go free without any remaining debt. So you have all these provisions that look out for the humanity of the person. In fact, if someone strikes a servant so that he dies, then that person will be that will be avenged, which is a picture of capital punishment. So it's not as though you're striking a piece of furniture and there's a death penalty involved here. It's not a property crime; it's a person crime. What about the picture of the foreign servant? A lot of people will bring this up, and I spend 3 chapters on this in my book, Is God a Vindictive Bully, where Leviticus 25 talks about foreign servants. People say, yeah, that's the Israelites. Okay, but what about foreign servants? And sure enough, there are some, when you look at the text, you say, well, it says you can acquire these foreign servants and pass them on to your children. Well, what's going on here? Well, the alien and sojourner who dwell, or this, the alien who sojourns in your midst, however that's translated, that same person who can be, quote, acquired, by Israelites is that same person. People will stop reading at verse 46, and then they won't read to 47 because it says, if an alien who is sojourning among you becomes a person of means, prospers, that person can actually take on an Israelite servant to hire for himself to work. That's not ideal, but again, that becomes a possibility. And so we read that word acquire is used of both, having a foreign servant, but also an Israelite servant. You can have an Israelite servant, it says at the end of Leviticus, who prospers. If he prospers, he can buy himself out of servitude. Or, but that foreigner could also prosper. So you can have a kind of upward mobility within Israel. And so that foreign servant is not left there to continue on, but he can actually become a person of means, says buy himself out of servitude, and even potentially acquiring an Israelite servant to work for him. So again, there are all these other matters that can be brought in here, and I spent a lot of time talking about this. But so we need to understand that there's a very different context going on here than what we see going on in the antebellum South. There is a very humanizing ethic for the people of Israel, both for the foreigner as well as the as well as the native.
And there you go. You have a great example of how Dr. Paul Copan can offer some very satisfying answers to these difficult challenges.
Yeah, and as he's talking, I'm just thinking, like, listener, don't you see how this is helpful? This is helpful work for us to do, to understand the time and place, this culture that we read about in the Old Testament and the New Testament, frankly,
Sure.
because we're also not in first century Israel either. But it's important work for us to do, because as you're talking, Paul, I'm just thinking, oh yeah, this comes from the goodness of God. These laws, these provisions are rooted in his goodness. And that reminds me, oh yeah, this is about God's goodness. This is a God worthy of worship. And don't we see how this work is important, because it could get in the way of truly understanding the God who made us, the Lord who calls us. And we want to remove those things from our own minds and hearts, but also from our kids too, so that they truly see God for who he is. And it takes some work, but it's worthy work.
Yeah, and I'll just close with this reflection. Thank God we have guys like Paul Copan on our side.
Amen.
Appreciate that.
And there is a sense where a lot of us who are listening, parents who are listening, who maybe, a stay-at-home mom or stay-at-home dad, a businessman or woman, or some other professional, they can't do the scholarship. But we have men and women like you, Paul, that we can rely on, who are doing this kind of work for the church. And so thank you for being on our side. And we appreciate the work you're doing.
Well, it's a privilege to be on the same team with you guys. Thank you for what you're doing.
Well, thanks for being with us.
Appreciate it.
MAVEN exists to help the next generation know truth, pursue goodness, and create beauty for the cause of Christ. To find out more, check out maventruth.com.